everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic of today's webinar is renewable thermal and RPSs, examples from New Hampshire, Oregon, and Vermont. Our hosts for today are Sam Donald and Val Stori. Sam is the communications coordinator and Val is the project director here at Clean Energy Group. We also have some excellent guest speakers with us on the line. Before I pass it over to them, I just wanted to go over some quick housekeeping notes and the agenda. We're going to start with housekeeping, an introduction, an overview, and then give it over to our speakers for some state examples and end with a Q&A. All of our attendees today are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can call in via telephone, or you can connect via your computer's mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so you can view the webinar slides full screen, click on the little orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also use that orange arrow to expand the webinar console. Following our webinar presentation, we are saving about 15 minutes for a Q&A with the audience. We ask that you please submit your questions by typing them into the questions box on your webinar console and hitting send. We're going to get to as many questions as we can. We have a lot of people registered today, which means that we'll probably get to a lot, but not all of the questions. To make sure that we get to your questions, please type them in when you think of them. Don't wait till the very end. Finally, this webinar is being recorded. We will post a recording of this webinar on our website, cleanenergygroup.org/webinars, and we will also send you a follow-up email within 48 hours with a link so you can see them. And now I'd like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, Val and Sam, as I said earlier, and they'll be introducing our webinar topic and today's guest speakers.
Great. Thank you, Mari. So as Mari mentioned, this webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, which is a partner organization of Clean Energy Group. The Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, is a national nonprofit coalition of public agencies and organizations working together to advance clean energy. You can see the logos of our member organizations on the screen here. So today's webinar is being presented by the RPS Collaborative. This is one of CESA's projects. The RPS Collaborative serves as a forum for the exchange of experiences and lessons learned regarding the implementation of state renewable portfolio standards. The RPS Collaborative is supported by the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy, and it's facilitated by CESA. And our members include state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, and other people like yourself who are interested in RPS issues. So if you'd like to learn more about the RPS Collaborative and learn more about our resources, I encourage you to visit our website, cesa.org/projects/renewable portfolio standards. There's a lot of great resources there, including a link to sign up for our monthly newsletter, all kinds of publications, and announcements about events and webinars. So today we are talking about renewable thermal in renewable portfolio standards, and CESA has recently published 2 reports related to this topic. These reports, which are available on our website, are titled Renewable Thermal and State Renewable Portfolio Standards. And we also have case studies of RPS best practices. One of those case studies is on thermal inclusion. Specifically, it's on the example of New Hampshire. And we do have guest speakers with us from New Hampshire today. And we also have the author of this case study with us, Val Stori. So Val will be talking about that case study in just a moment. But first, the case study about renewable thermal in state RPSs is an interesting report. I encourage you to check it out. One of the things that we talk about in that report is 14 states that do have RPS included in, do have renewable thermal included in the RPS. We give an overview of these 14 states and what their programs include, and we talk a little bit broadly about renewable thermal and RPSs. The 14 programs that include renewable thermal vary very widely in terms of which technologies are eligible, how the output is measured and monitored, how REC values are determined, and how the technologies are classified in the RPS. So there's a lot of variation, some very interesting programs. We have 3 of those states with us today to discuss their programs, and you'll be learning a lot today, but I also encourage you to check out that paper, which is available on our website. Another thing included in the paper is a broad overview of why to include renewable thermal in an RPS. So the reason we updated this paper in the first place is because it was originally published in 2015. We republished it this year because more states have been adding renewable thermal to their RPS. And there are a lot of good reasons why they have been doing that. Adding clean energy technologies to an RPS is a powerful way to promote their development and market growth. So including renewable thermal is a great way to support those technologies. Using certain renewable sources like biomass to produce heat is more efficient than using them to produce electricity. That's another reason. And finally, renewable thermal heating and cooling achieves a main policy goal of an RPS to help people transition away from fossil fuels to cleaner, renewable, and local technologies. So lots of good reasons. One of the challenges that states are having in incorporating renewable thermal into their RPSs is that RPSs were designed to track and measure electricity generation, not heat or cooling, thermal. So that's one of the challenges that states are facing. So read more about this in the report. Again, it's on our website. So the second report that I mentioned that CISA produced, this case study was written by Stori. It goes into depth on New Hampshire's RPS. I'm going to pass it over to Val to talk about that.
Great, thanks, Sam. And you will be hearing more about New Hampshire's thermal RPS directly from Karen and Deandra at the Sustainable Energy Division at the New Hampshire PUC. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the analysis that we had done for this case study. We were specifically looking for examples of innovative programs in the RPS, and New Hampshire's thermal program stood out to us since it was the first RPS program in the nation to include renewable heat eligibility. So we decided to do a deeper dive into that. And as Sam mentioned, including these new renewable heating and cooling technologies in the RPS is a way to spur their market growth. But the other thing that it does is it sparks job creation and economic impacts either in the state or in the region. So one of the things we looked at in the case study on New Hampshire's thermal inclusion was the economic impact of New Hampshire's thermal rec incentive from the development, specifically of woody biomass thermal projects. The case study as a whole looked at New Hampshire's thermal RPS program, and we looked at the program's legislative history, we wrote a program summary, we reported on the results of the program, we assessed its strengths and its limitations, and we included lessons learned and recommendations for New Hampshire and other states considering including or updating thermal provisions in their RPS. And as I mentioned, New Hampshire will be talking more specifically about their program in a second. But I wanted to take a minute to point out some of the economic impact findings that our analysis yielded. And in fact, this analysis was done by Innovative Natural Resource Solutions. We hired them to do the economic analysis on 21 woody biomass thermal projects that have qualified for thermal recs. And as you can see on the screen, we found that the 21 projects in 2017 displaced an estimated 1,500,000 gallons of number 2 heating oil, generated over 43,000 thermal recs, and those in turn generated nearly $1 million in gross revenue for the 21 system owners, who reduced their heating costs by an estimated $1,300,000 by switching to wood fuels. And then using an economic impact multiplier of about 2.1, and that was applied to the sum of the heat cost savings, the wood fuel sales, and the TREC revenue, in all found an estimated over $8 million in beneficial economic impacts to the regional economy. So some great analysis and data there. And moving on to the next presentation with Karen and Deandra, they'll talk about the program and other program results. So next slide, please. This is the list of all of today's speakers, and I'll introduce everyone before their presentation. So first up, we have Deandra Perruccio and Karen Cramton from the Sustainable Energy Division of New Hampshire's Public Utilities Commission. And just a reminder to go ahead and type in any questions you have, and if possible, type in the speaker you would like your question addressed to, since we have multiple speakers today. Deandra and Karen, thanks for being here.
Great, thanks, Val. And this is Deandra, and Karen and I are going to share this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our metering requirements first. So our thermal energy was included in the New Hampshire RPS through legislation that was enacted in 2012. And that created a carve-out within our Class 1 source requirement. So that's our new renewable sources. So it created a carve-out within that source class and required the Commission to come up with rules about how we were going to measure thermal energy, verify production, and report that energy to NEPOOL GIS. Sorry, the slides were a little bit delayed. So useful thermal energy defined in our legislation is renewable energy that's coming from a Class 1 source. So these are the new renewable sources that can be metered and is delivered in New Hampshire to an end user in the form of heat, basically for any thermal process that otherwise would require the use of electricity or another type of fuel. Just waiting for the slides. So some of the eligible technologies in our Class 1 sources include geothermal, solar thermal, methane gas, and a variety of eligible biomass, types of biomass and biofuels. All of these sources, in order to be eligible for thermal production, for thermal RECs, have to have begun operation or been installed after January 1st of 2013. We have a number of requirements around REC eligibility for thermal sources, so emissions requirements. These we developed with, in conjunction with our New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. And so for particulate matter, anything under 3 MMBTU is required to certify that they're going to conduct best management practices, and this was something that was developed with NHDES. So that's about 880 kW and below. Anything above that, they then start to have monitoring requirements, which they work with DES on regularly. For NOx emissions, it's similar. However, the size demarcation for monitoring is much larger. So anything under 100 MMBTU per hour, those are best management practices. That's about 29 megawatts. So those are really large systems. And then once you're above that size, you have monitoring that you have to do through DES to be eligible for our programs. And one note is that our electric eligibility is actually a little bit more stringent than these thermal requirements. So we have a number of metering requirements as well. They're different for large and small facilities, and they also are different based on the type of technology that's being metered. The demarcation for large and small, this was recently changed, and I think Karen's going to talk a little bit about that, but we increased it from 200,000 MMBTU up to 1 million BTU an hour as for large systems. And there are pretty detailed methodology requirements for the metering that are laid out in our rules. We're not going to go into that detail here, but for all of the systems, the boundaries for the thermal measurement, you have to be measuring the thermal output before the heat's going out through the distribution system. We have a number of requirements around the accuracy ratings. So for air and liquid systems, you're using flow and temperature sensors, and those either have to meet an accuracy that's the European standard 1434-1. So you can either meet that, or you can meet a 5% or better accuracy rating for all of your temperature and flow sensors, and that compliance has to be confirmed and signed off on by a professional engineer licensed in the state. We also allow for both air and steam and liquid systems. You can apply for an alternative metering method. Those also have to be 5% accuracy or better, and they have to be attested to by a professional engineer as well, and we review those on a case-by-case basis. For steam systems, you can either have a meter accuracy of 3% or better, 5% or better, or potentially an alternative method that doesn't match up with our detailed methods that are listed in our rules, as long as they're better than 5%. And then for small systems, we do allow parametric monitoring. So for systems below 1 MMBTU, there are a number of different calculations depending on the technology that you can use to calculate your production. So in order to get certified, as I've been mentioning, a professional engineer has to attest to the metering and that the metering arrangement meets all of our rules and methods and meets our accuracy requirements. An independent monitor has to complete initial inspection of the system. Typically, the independent monitor is also a professional engineer, so those are very often the same folks. And then that independent monitor, once your system is certified, verifies the production, does the calculation, reports that production to NEPOOL GIS on at least a quarterly basis. And for some facilities, if you're over, those emissions requirements that were in the past slides, you may have some quarterly verification and reporting that you do through DES, and that comes to us as well. So the calculation that the monitors do to determine the production levels that they're reporting to NEPOOL, so they follow these, detailed requirements on metering methodology to get their thermal output measurement. And then there's a number of discounts that may or may not be applied. So there's a meter accuracy discount. If the accuracy of the meter doesn't meet the European standard, they have to, do a discount. And then for large systems, there's an assumed losses discount. So that's just assuming that you have some kind of parasitic load or storage losses. And those are dictated through our rules. They're laid out and are different by technology. So the independent monitor will add those deductions and do the calculation. And then they do have to, you mentioned that a lot of RPS are set up for electricity. So they do have to convert the MMBTU and report in megawatt hours, which is has not seemed to be too difficult. And so Karen's going to talk a little bit about, us meeting our requirements and some of the impacts that we've been seeing in the state so far.
Great, thank you. So this is Karen. Since Deandra just took you through the different technologies and how these technologies become certified, I'm going to go back and take a look now at the policy perspective of this and how thermal fits into New Hampshire's RPS. So the table that you're seeing on the screen right now, the center column that's highlighted in blue shows our thermal carve-out. As Deandra mentioned, this is a carve-out from our total Class 1 requirement, and it actually started at 0% way back in 2008 when the RPS was created. When the geothermal legislation passed, they started off at, I believe it was 0.4%, and now we are expecting a growth of 0.2% annually in this carve-out. And the other thing I'd like to mention is one of the things that the PUC and the legislation has given us authority to do is for good cause and after public notice and hearing, the PUC does have the authority to either accelerate or delay that 0.2% annual increase. So for example, if we're seeing that we just don't have enough facilities coming online to meet the increase, we can delay the increase. And we're doing that primarily to keep a handle on the cost of the RPS. So to not have our ratepayers incur any costs that they don't need to bear. So how do these ACPs work and how do RECs work? As you know, RPS compliance can be met in one of two ways, either through the purchase of a renewable energy certificate, often referred to as a REC, or through the payment of an alternative compliance payment, or an ACP. So in New Hampshire, our ACP rate for thermal is a little over $25 this year. It increases annually by half of the consumer price index. And to put that in perspective, the ACP rate is roughly 1/2 of the Class 1 ACP rate. And again, that was done, number one, because it was thought that it was appropriate to have the incentive for thermal to be less than Class 1. It was thought that the full ACP wasn't necessary, and also to help keep down the cost of the RPS. As in other RPSs, the REC price, or what the REC is trading on, is a market-based principle. So it's the price is really dependent on supply and demand. So the screen that we have up now shows you the certified facilities in New Hampshire, and we're showing you back starting in 2014, which is the first year that we certified facilities. The top graph is showing the quantity, or the number of different facilities that are certified in New Hampshire. The bottom chart is showing that those same facilities, but showing you the total capacity for all of those facilities. So as you can see, we are seeing an increase. It was slow to start off, but you can see between 2016 and 2017 that we really did see significant growth of about 50%. And that's for obviously a variety of reasons. Most of our certified facilities are wood biomass facilities. However, we do have 9 geothermal facilities, and our very first liquid biofuel facility was certified in 2018. So from a REC compliance perspective, again, this is looking at the RPS compliance on an annual basis and showing you what % of the overall requirement was met with RECs, which are in purple, versus ACPs, which are shown in green. And as you can see, we've pretty much stuck in the 20 percentile range for compliance with RECs. And again, that's for reasons that it is taking this market a little bit of time to mature and get up to speed. And it's also because if you look on the bottom, I'm showing you the requirement. So the obligation has increased. So even though 2016 to 2017, we were at 24 versus 29%, the obligation almost doubled. So even though the ratio between RECs and ACP might not look like we're making progress, we are actually making progress when you compare it against the overall requirement. So how do we incentivize these projects and get more online? In New Hampshire, our alternative compliance payments go into a renewable energy fund, and those renewable energy funds or monies then are used to support and incentivize new project development here in New Hampshire. So we do that for the biomass industry in a couple of ways. Number one, we have pellet rebate programs, both residential and commercial. And we also have a competitive grant solicitation every year that we're required to do by statute. And we do allow biomass technologies that are not eligible for rebates to participate in that RFP. The screen that's being shown right now just shows you our rebate programs. As you can see, we've awarded over 400 rebates at this point, spurring investment of over $10 million. Our commercial and industrial grant program, again, this is used for all technologies that we don't offer rebates for, but if you look at the shaded purple part of that pie chart, you'll see that we've incentivized 19 different thermal-based projects. I'm sorry, actually 20 thermal-based projects, and that's from everything from landfill gas. Whoops, that's actually electricity. I'm sorry, it's 19. But we do have solar thermal and geothermal in there, and there's some pictures. So the benefits of the RPS, I won't go into a lot of detail because we are getting close to our 15-minute allocation. Val went over a number of these in her forward. So we'll just say that, yes, we are recognizing the things that Val had stated, keeping fuel diversity, fuel dollars in New Hampshire, and spurring economic growth. Some recent and upcoming changes that we've seen. Last year, we did introduce methane gas as an eligible fuel source for thermal purposes into the RPS. And what we see coming up is, number one, possibly some changes to our rebate programs. Also, we're looking at, through legislation, expanding methods by which energy can be measured and monitored and reported. What I mean by that is right now we are measuring the fuel output. It may be helpful and easier to be measuring fuel input. We're also looking at possibly changing the monitoring requirements, changing the requirements of that class once the methane gas facilities are part of the program. We're thinking it's going to be easier for them to generate RECs, and we might see a surplus of RECs because of those facilities coming online. And the final thing that we'll be looking at are some additional 2500 rule changes to make the registration and certification processes easier. And with that, our final screen shows you the website where you can certainly get a lot more information about our program and contact information for Deandra. Thank you.
Great. Thanks to you both. Just a reminder to type in any questions if you've got them. And now moving on to our second presentation in thermal energy in Oregon, Oregon's RPS, we have Rebecca O'Neill from the Oregon Department of Energy. Welcome, Rebecca.
Hello. Actually, my name is Rebecca Smith. Rebecca O'Neill is at PNNL, and I covered her resume. I am a senior energy policy analyst at the Oregon Department of Energy, and I spearheaded the rulemaking that we did on thermal energy here back in 2016, adding it to the RPS. Let's see if I can get this slide to advance.
On the first slide, it should advance it. There we go.
There we go. Okay. So before we dive into the specifics, I'll just give you some really light background on Oregon's RPS. Every state is different. And the enabling statute for adding thermal to the RPS. And then I'll go through some of the major issues that we dealt with throughout the rulemaking process, and then a quick view of what the program looks like today. So in Oregon, our RPS is, the compliance end of it is administered either by the PUC for our investor-owned utilities or for our many consumer-owned utilities by their respective boards. ODO, however, we handle eligibility. We do have some statutory authority there with respect to the types of feedstocks that are eligible, and then we also certify facilities as eligible to generate electricity for the RPS. So in 2016, we had a huge energy bill pass, 1547. And so in addition to adding thermal RECs to the RPS, it increased our RPS targets. It eliminated coal by wire. There was a lot going on in it. So perhaps it's no surprise that the section on adding thermal to the RPS was very brief. Essentially, all it told us was that one, and this is unique to our program, that thermal energy had to result from the generation of electricity using biomass. Second, that thermal energy had to be used for a secondary purpose. And then it said that as part of this system established for, allowing for REC generation, that we must allow RECs for this generation of thermal energy. And then it gave us a very common conversion factor of megawatt hour to BTUs. So that was great. However, there was a lot of areas where we did not have clear statutory direction. One of these, for example, was that even though this statute made reference to some of the sections of the RPS, it was never explicit in the statute that this will be part of the RPS, that these RECs will count as RPS compliance instruments. We only had so much statutory authority to handle that in the rulemaking, but our interpretation was that that was implicit, and we sought to make it as explicit as possible. But so that raised questions of these, are these TRECs really RECs? Do the same rules apply to TRECs? This was not a fait accompli when we started this rulemaking. Also, it didn't reference our RPS directly, so it wasn't clear that we had to limit the biomass to RPS eligible biomass sources. If there was some sort of threshold for how much electricity had to be generated versus the thermal energy generated, and then it was utterly silent on any sort of methodology for measurement, reporting, and verification. So no surprise, those were some of the biggest questions that we tackled during the rulemaking process. And we did that throughout the summer and fall of 2016. So it was a fast process. We were under quite a lot of pressure from our stakeholders to get moving. In digging into the definition of secondary purpose, we found it important to really be clear on what was qualifying thermal energy and what was station service. And we had this question, especially in relation to on-site processing of fuel. For example, we had potential for seeing a lot of torrefaction of biomass here, and so there was the question of, well, can we use thermal energy to torrefy this biomass that we're then going to feed into our boiler to create electricity, create thermal energy to torrefy more biomass. And so we determined that anything that was in direct support of the electricity generation was station service and not qualifying thermal energy. We did make a distinction for digesters. However, our interpretation was that using thermal energy to heat a digester was in service to the anaerobic digestion and not to the generation of electricity. A byproduct of the digestion process would be natural gas that could be combusted to generate electricity, but the digestion of a waste stream was seen as the primary activity and would happen in absence of the generation of electricity. So that was probably one of the biggest discussions that we had. Then certainly we looked at fuel displacement. We looked at what New Hampshire and other states were doing, and then how we wanted to set up a metering requirements. Estimation is anathema to Regis, and to most people here out west. We see it as an issue of REC integrity. So looking up at how to set up our metering requirements. So the program as it stands today, as much as we could make it explicit in our rules, we really tied it to the RPS as much as possible, since that wasn't as explicit as we would have liked in the original statute. And we waited through this whole process. It took us about 6 months to do our rules, which will probably sound ridiculous to some of the states who have had a number of years to work through this process. But the program that we ended up with, as I said, is very RPS focused. So we made it clear that RPS eligible biomass feedstocks would be only those eligible for the generation of that electricity that would then result in the thermal energy. As with the RPS, multi-fuel facilities can qualify, but only for the portion attributable to eligible biomass-fired electricity generation. For our RPS, biomass is included woody biomass. It also includes manure, animal waste. However, it does not include geothermal or solar thermal. So those are not included in our thermal program here, which is certainly different than a lot of other states. It's primarily on the woody biomass and digester side. We didn't go into every kind of qualifying thermal energy. We've got some pretty similar language here to what New Hampshire has. We did keep a fuel displacement with fuel and or electricity, and then we got pretty specific with our station service, mostly in relationship to that on-site fuel processing question. One of the biggest changes to this versus our other RPS certification was that we ask for a thermal energy management plan, and we ask for it to be quite substantive. So it includes all of the information on the thermal energy generating equipment, as well as the electricity generating equipment, secondary purposes. We look at all of the data measurement, collection, and storage, system calibration, and then the accuracy therein. We use similar standards to New Hampshire. And then the calculation methodology we've left as something that we finalize with the applicant throughout the certification process. And so we certainly allow them to suggest a methodology, and then we look through that in terms of discount factors, any other questions that we feel we want to answer. So with respect to MMV, all facilities have to meter the thermal energy going to the secondary purposes, so no big surprise there. We wanted to have a threshold for small and large facilities and allow some of these small facilities to have some relief on the administrative costs. Because our thermal program is tied to electricity generation, there's no residential dimension to this. So we've already got a smaller pool of eligible facilities, and then our small and large, there's a little bit less of a spread between there. And so we're also expecting fewer facilities. We look at New Hampshire with 100 million BTUs per hour, and we're just not seeing facilities. We're not going to see a lot of facilities with that. So we chose as 1 TREC per hour, which is essentially, 3 million BTUs per hour is that threshold for small and large. And so these small facilities, one, they can self-report under Regis, and then 2, they can use as constants certain parameters in their calculations that represent de minimis values and that have variance that is no more than plus or minus 2% under the full range of expected operating conditions. These have to be updated annually, and we worked with Regis to come up with something that was not estimation, but that would provide some metering relief for some of these small facilities without sacrificing data integrity. You have to take your data readings every hour. Everybody does that much more often. And then the large facilities cannot self-report. They have to use a non-balancing thermal qualified reporting entity, and often that will just be a professional engineer. So going through this whole process, we certainly learned a lot. I have to thank the other states that have trod some of this path ahead of us. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, also spoke to folks in North Carolina. I reached out to them early and often, really wanted to learn as much about their programs and some of the hurdles that they overcame. And I really tried to stay in touch with them as well because I wanted to harass them throughout the process and steal as much from them as possible. That said, our program was, very different. All of these programs are really different. So the best practices that you can adapt there are limits. So we also had to get creative. So for example, kind of where to set that threshold for small and large in a way that was going to make sense for Oregon. The coming up with the allowance for use of constants for certain parameters. That was a novel approach that we chose to use that our engineers developed. And certainly we made some mistakes throughout this process. We did the rules in 6 months. The biggest error that we had to fix, I think, was just the timing. Everything took longer than we thought it would. It took longer for Regis to get their functionality up and running, for facilities to be able to get in there and start the certification process. It took us much longer to actually certify a facility, a lot of back and forth with engineers, site visits. We really underestimated that. But we were able to move forward and fix those. So thus far, our program where we're at now is that we have received 4 applications thus far for certification. Like I said, it's a much smaller pool of potential applicants than other states. One of which has been certified as of October of this year. The first one was a wastewater treatment plant with a digester. And the other, we're getting interest as well from pulp and paper operations and digesters. So those look to be the biggest types of facilities we're expecting to work with. We have just kind of had the first tranche of those TRECs generated. So in terms of where the market is and their value, that is still up in the air. But because we've made it clear that these are fungible with electricity-based RECs and for RPS compliance, we fully expect them to assume that value in the marketplace. But with all things we will see as we move forward, and we're certainly working with continual improvement and, of course, looking to our other states and trying to see how we can learn from them as well. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. All right, we are moving back to the East Coast. Next, we are going to hear from Andy Perchlik from the Clean Energy Development Fund at the Vermont Public Service Commission. And Department, thank you. And we will learn about how thermal is included in the new clean energy standard. Thanks, Andy.
Right. Well, thank you. So I'll try to go quickly so we can have time for questions. Here's my complicated outline of what the talk is going to go over. In case you get lost, you can refer to that. And so a couple things to remember about Vermont's program is we have a portfolio or a renewable energy standard, not a portfolio, which is actually an important distinction in Vermont for the governor that passed this and the legislature at the time, because we already have a pretty clean electric mix, and folks didn't want to. We had an RPS, but it was a voluntary RPS, and people wanted to do something different than other states, and so we included all all energy, because we were doing well on electricity, but not in transportation and heating and cooling. So that's what the RPS, or our renewable energy standard, is meant to address. And people are familiar with renewable energy portfolios standards to have classes, but we had tiers as part of our effort to try to be different. So we like other RPSs, our standard does have 3 tiers, but they cover different things. Tier 1 is like other class 1s. It's the big box of the renewable energy generation. Vermont already had a 55% clean renewable energy electricity in 2017 when this standard came into effect. It was passed in 2015, but had a couple of years for the utilities to get prepared. And it increases 4% a year, so the distributed utilities have to get to 75% by 2032. And all renewable energy is included, and that includes large hydro. We used to not include large hydro, which is basically the hydro we import from Quebec, as not renewable, but as part of this process, we did include it as renewable. The only technology that I could think of that some states do consider renewable that we do not is waste energy. Our second tier is the distributed generation tier, and that's a carve out of tier 1. And it's starting in 2017, it's 1%, increasing to 10% of electric sales. And this is just for our larger utility, our one IOU utility, as well as a couple of the others. The smaller muni and co-ops that we have that have under 6,000 customers got more time to start. They don't have to comply with this till 2019. So next year is their first compliance year. And so this was designed, like other RPSs, to drive the more local distributed generation on the Vermont grid. And so we think that's going to be 25, 30 megawatts a year. Net metering counts for this tier, and these tier 2 compliance can be bought and sold within the state amongst the different distributed utilities. So our third tier is where we would have something like thermal RECs, which we don't have thermal RECs. We have this tier 3 compliance mechanism, which we call the energy transformation tier. And that starts at 2% of electric sales and goes up to 12%, but it's not a carve out, it's just separate. Although tier 2 RECs can, if you have extra, can carry over into tier 3. And the way we did this is we did it as the displacement of fossil fuels. Instead of just the generation of thermal energy, although that's how we categorize it, we change it into how much fossil fuel are the system savings. And this was to encourage utilities to reach out and try to help us with the other sectors. You know, we don't regulate, like other states, do not regulate the home heating fuels, and we don't regulate transportation fuels. And this is a way to let our regulated utilities kind of help us slowly make that transition to renewable fuels in those sectors. I realized I didn't have any graphs or pictures, which I thought was some violation of PowerPoint. So I included this graph in here that just shows you the ramp up of the 3 tiers that we have. And so that third one, the energy transformation, is basically our thermal component. But since it's just tied to fossil fuel savings, it's not just thermal. It is largely actually electric vehicles and heat pumps, but they're measured on a BTU savings and converted to megawatt hour savings. So some other components that we have that are similar to other RPSs, we have an alternative compliance payment, but we set it pretty high, set it at $60, increases at this 1.3%. We only have had the first year, 2017, everybody met the obligations without having to pay the compliance payment. But if they do ever get to a point, well, it will come to the Clean Energy Development Fund to be used for incentives. And so instead of doing the thermal metering that other states that have thermal energy in their RPSs have done, we decided to go this other route and use a technical advisory group, which folks might be familiar with. States do use these for efficiency measures, if you have energy efficiency programs that you regulate and evaluate. And since we had already set that up for our efficiency programs, we just basically created the same kind of structure to create this conversion for the tier 3 compliance. It's like if you're going to how much fossil fuel you save, what's the value of that on a megawatt hour basis. And once the technical advisory group, once the TAG approves that, then utilities just go forward and do those and claim the savings based on the number of units that they converted, like number of heat pumps they installed, number of electric vehicles they got their customers to buy, number of pellet boilers that they got their customers installed. So we don't try to actually measure the BTU of all those pellet boilers. We just say you did X number of pellet boilers, that's worth Y megawatt hours, because they already went through all that in the TAG process. There's both prescriptive and custom measures in this tier 3. The prescriptive measures go through that TAG process and get a megawatt hour value assigned to them. But utilities can also do custom projects where they just might have a customer that comes to them. We've had a few of these where it's only going to be 1 or 2 that they ever get to. A couple examples are, we had a few lumber mills that had diesel generators at them. because the electric service wasn't adequate for the size of their motors, and so they were running diesel generators. The utility upgraded the service, and so since there was fossil fuel savings by not running that generator anymore, that qualified as a custom measure, and they got the equivalent megawatt hour savings of that fossil fuel saved. They've also done that with some maple syrup sugars evaporators that had to run had to run diesel generators during the sugaring season. They ran an electric line out to them, and then they got those savings. And they can come to us beforehand and get approval on the custom measures on what the megawatt hour savings are going to be, or they can just do them and then go to the PUC during the compliance filings and make the argument of why it should be included. I already said this, they generate thermal savings and then get converted into megawatt hour savings. And we do a subtract. If it's something like an electric car, yes, they're saving fossil fuels, but they're using electricity, and that electricity is not going to be 100% renewable for most of our utilities, although we do have a couple utilities in Vermont that are 100% renewable, so they don't get a reduction. But the other ones, we do some math there where we take away what their non-renewable electricity component is. And here's my contact information if anybody wants to reach out with questions. And I can send you all sorts of other examples or documents or reports on this. Back to you, Val.
All right, great. Thank you, Andy. And thanks for everyone for typing in some great questions. We've got a whole suite of them and about 10 minutes left. So let's start. Andy, why don't we start with you? As you're calculating BTU to megawatt hour savings, do you calculate in any loss factors for the conversion of fossil fuels to electricity or fuels to electricity?
Yeah, we do have a heat rate, and it's actually in the statute that we have to use I think we use whatever the EIA establishes as the nationwide heat rate conversion. And there's some question about whether that's the best one to use for Vermont, but yeah, that is in there.
Great. And what are the megawatt hour credits for typical residential heat pumps?
Yeah, so for I'm just looking at a report here for one of the utilities. Looks like 37 megawatt hours for the installation of a cold climate heat pump. That's the lifetime savings. I think the lifetime savings for a heat pump is 7 years, 10 years. So they get the lifetime savings in the year that they install these technologies.
Is it longer for ground source heat pumps and a different rate?
I don't know if it is. I don't know if it would be a different weight. It probably would be, because they're more likely going to be 100% of the heating load, where heat pumps most often are not. But we don't have a lot of ground source heat pumps, and and I don't know of any programs to support them. So none of the utilities are using ground source heat pumps to meet their obligations. They're doing cold climate heat pumps. Electric vehicles are the prime ones, but some biomass, pellet conversions as well, but not a lot.
Okay. And it looks like this might be the last one for you, Andy. So you mentioned how energy savings are calculated. What about weatherization? Does that work into your energy transformation tier at all?
Yeah, they can do weatherization, and they just have to show the fossil fuel savings. So if they have a program that's on top of our other weatherization programs that we have in the state, and they can show that customers are doing these measures with their incentives, they can claim those fossil fuel savings, and there are prescriptive measures for megawatt hour savings for those measures.
Okay, thank you. All right, moving over to Oregon. We had a couple of questions come in. If you could revisit and clarify a little bit about digesters. So let me start here. So does heating a digester qualify for T-Rex? Why or why not?
Yes. So our interpretation was that, yes, a digester using that heat to keep the digester warm would qualify for thermal RECs. The distinction that we saw was that the primary activity of the digester was not generation of electricity. The primary activity was digestion of a waste stream that, if it weren't digested, would have to be disposed of in some other fashion and with cost, and only, though, it would be eligible only if you could show that if not for that thermal energy, that you would be using either fuel or electricity to heat the digester.
Okay. And then as a follow-up, are cogen systems the only type of thermal use that are eligible for T-Rex?
That is correct, and that was all based on the statute. That bill that passed, it pretty much said only cogen, and only cogen that was biomass fired. And so that's why our program doesn't include any other RPS eligible electricity feedstocks.
Got it. All right. Are there any local content requirements? Does the biomass have to come from Oregon?
So we stuck with the RPS requirements, and so within the RPS there are requirements with respect to if it's forest or rangeland woody debris, in terms of how it was harvested and where it came from. Not only is there no requirement that it comes from Oregon, but eligibility for generating T-Rex is not limited to Oregon. I should have probably mentioned that earlier. We saw thermal RECs as inherently unbundled because they're not associated with any delivery of energy to the grid, and thus we went with what the RPS geographic requirements were for location for unbundled RECs, and that is within the boundary of WEC. And so that so we have one facility that has applied that is in Washington State, and we may have some California applicants as well.
Great, thank you for that clarification. As you expect your program to grow, do you expect wastewater treatment plants and their associated digesters to participate in the T-Rec program, and how would they do that?
We absolutely do, and our first certified facility is a wastewater treatment plant. It's in the city of Gresham here in Oregon, and so they again, if they meet all of the requirements with respect to that digester, if they are, the Gresham also used some of the waste heat in terms of district heating within the facility, and so heat going to the digester was not the only qualifying secondary purpose that they had. But so if it is going to the digester, one of the big hurdles is you have to show that there's either fuel or electricity displacement, that your process needed that to happen, and that you would expend fuel or electricity to do so otherwise. So we certainly hope that more wastewater treatment plants will apply, and we've gotten some nibbles of interest from some agricultural digesters, so some animal manure digesters.
Terrific, thanks. We only have a couple of minutes left, so let me get some questions over to New Hampshire. A local content question for you. New Hampshire doesn't have a local content requirement for wood for pellets and chips, but where does the wood come from? Do you know?
Yeah, we don't have a requirement, so it's not something that we review here. I mean, just anecdotally, we do have a pretty big forestry industry in New Hampshire and in the Northeast in general, but we don't have any process for reviewing or around where the fuel comes from.
There are a couple of manufacturers, though, that I can add. We gave a grant one year to a manufacturer who produces precision dried chips, and they're actually using biomass to dry the chips. So we know that a lot of our dried chips are quote unquote manufactured in New Hampshire and then delivered to facilities in New Hampshire.
Great, thank you. I know we've reached the hour, so we're just going to stay on for a few more minutes. So feel free to stay on the line, anyone who can. So you have just added methane gas for thermal applications to the RPS. What motivated that inclusion?
That was through legislation. Methane gas has always been part of the RPS when used for generating electricity. The thermal, the addition to use it for thermal purposes was just done through legislation. I believe it was one of our utilities that brought that forward and discussed it with the legislators.
Thank you. Earlier you mentioned some of the grant and incentive programs you have and how, for example, you use that to fund pellet manufacturing or wood chip drying in the state. Is anything being done to increase the number of geothermal systems in the state?
Nothing specifically. A number of years ago, the utilities were offering a rebate to geothermal. It is always open as part of our grant solicitation, so people can certainly apply. We've just only had one entity that's applied and was awarded a grant. So there's nothing specific, but they are always able to submit proposals to us.
Thank you. And as you update the RPS, is New Hampshire considering the inclusion of air source heat pumps as an eligible technology?
That was actually brought up during our RPS 2018 review. So I believe one of our recommendations out of that review was to at least always consider the inclusion of new technologies. But that would be, in order to include that, it would require legislation. So one of our recommendations, I believe, was to study whether or not new technologies should be included in the thermal class.
Thank you. And the last question actually is for you, Sam. As you did research for your paper, did you talk with states that considered adding a thermal component to their RPS but didn't? So in other words, have a broader group of states considered adding, or are they in the process of adding a thermal component to the RPS?
Yes, definitely. I know a couple states are thinking about this issue and have been for a while and have been trying to push it through. So yes, there are several states working on this, and there were some requests for this webinar topic for that reason, because people are interested in finding out how other states have been able to push it through and examples of successful programs. So it's definitely an area of interest for more states than the 14 that currently have programs.
Great, thank you. Thank you to all our participants and all the panelists. Thanks for staying beyond the hour. I hope this conversation has been useful. Thank you for the terrific presentations to all our panelists. Should you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And of course, you can download both papers referenced on this webinar at the link on your screen. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.